There are places in America where history doesn't just whisper, it screams. Where the ground itself remembers violence, where walls hold secrets darker than shadows, and where beauty was built upon bloodshed. In the heart of Savannah, Georgia, on a square lined with oak trees and Spanish moss, stands one such place. A mansion so grand it looks like something from a dream. But beneath its elegant columns and behind its shuttered windows lies a story most would rather forget. This is the Sorrel-Weed House, and its foundation was laid on a battlefield. October 9th, 1779. The air above Savannah filled with smoke and screams. French soldiers charged forward through the morning fog. American patriots ran beside them. Polish cavalry thundered across muddy ground. They were all trying to take back a city the British had stolen. The battle that followed became one of the bloodiest disasters of the American Revolution. Nearly 600 men were wounded. 244 were killed. Among the dead was Count Casimir Pulaski, the Polish hero who had helped train George Washington's cavalry. He fell from his horse, a canister shot tearing through his body. The British fortifications held. The assault failed. Bodies lay scattered across the fields. Blood soaked into Georgia clay, and when the smoke finally cleared, the land remembered. Decades later, that same blood-soaked ground would become the site of a mansion. Not just any mansion. One of the largest, most beautiful homes in the entire South. Built by a man who had already survived one revolution. A man who knew what it meant to run from fire and death. A man named Francis Sorrel. To understand the house, you must first understand the man who built it. Francis Sorrel wasn't born in America. He was born on May 4th, 1793, in a place most Americans had never heard of, Saint-Domingue, the French colony that would one day become Haiti. It was the richest colony in the world. Sugar plantations stretched for miles. Coffee grew thick on hillsides, and all of it was built on the backs of enslaved people who outnumbered their masters 10-1. Francis's father was Antoine François Sorel de Rivière, a French colonel sent to map the colony. The family name carried weight. They owned land. They had status. But in 1791, when Francis was just a boy, everything changed. The enslaved rose up. Plantations burned. Families fled into the night. What followed was the Haitian Revolution, one of history's most successful slave rebellions. It was brutal. It was necessary. And for families like the Sorrels, it was the end of their world. Young Francis escaped. Some accounts say a loyal servant helped save him. Others say his family simply ran when the fires came too close. Either way, he survived. But the trauma stayed with him. The memory of revolution, the smell of burning cane fields, the sound of a world collapsing. He carried those memories across the ocean to a new country, to America. In 1812, Francis Sorrel arrived in Newport, Rhode Island. He was 19 years old. He had no money, no connections, just a French name and a will to survive. 6 years later, in 1818, he became a naturalized American citizen in Baltimore. Then he moved south to Savannah, Georgia. It was a port city, a trading hub, a place where a man with ambition could make something of himself. And Francis Sorrel was nothing if not ambitious. Savannah in the early 1800s was booming. Cotton flowed through its docks. Ships came and went carrying goods to the Caribbean, to Europe, to ports up and down the American coast. Francis became a commission merchant. He traded goods with the West Indies, the same islands he'd fled as a child. He was good at it. Very good. By the 1820s, he was wealthy. By the 1830s, he was one of the richest men in Savannah. In 1822, Francis married Lucinda Ireland Moxley. She was from Virginia, refined, connected to old Southern families. Together they started building a life. But in 1827, yellow fever swept through Savannah. Lucinda died. Francis was devastated. 2 years later, in 1829, he did something unusual. He married Lucinda's younger sister, Matilda Aminta Douglas Moxley. In that era, such marriages were sometimes frowned upon, but not illegal. Matilda became his wife. Together they would have many children, and together they would build a mansion that would outlive them both. By the late 1830s, Francis Sorrel had everything a man could want: wealth, status, a growing family. But he needed a home that matched his success. Not just a house, a statement. So in 1839, he hired the most talented architect working in Georgia, an Irishman named Charles Blaney Kluski. Kluski had arrived in America in 1827, the same way Francis had. Young, foreign, hungry for success. He'd trained briefly in New York with the famous firm Town and Davis before moving to Savannah in 1829. He was brilliant, temperamental, arrogant, and absolutely gifted. He understood Greek Revival architecture the way a composer understands music. His buildings didn't just follow rules, they sang. Kluski had already made his mark across Georgia. In Augusta, he'd designed the medical college, a stunning structure that still stands today. In Milledgeville, he'd built the governor's mansion, a grand building with a soaring dome. But the house he would design for Francis Sorrel would be something different, something personal. When Francis approached him with the commission, Kluski saw an opportunity. This wasn't just another wealthy merchant wanting a big house. This was a man who understood loss, a man who'd survived revolution, a man who wanted to prove that he belonged in this new world. Kluski would give him a palace. Construction began in 1839. The location was significant. 6 West Harris Street, right on Madison Square. One of Savannah's most prestigious addresses. But beneath the surface, the land carried weight. This was where British soldiers had built their fortifications during the siege of Savannah 60 years earlier. This was where men had fought and died, where Count Pulaski had fallen, where blood had turned the ground dark. Archaeologists would later discover remnants of those old fortifications buried beneath the mansion's gardens. Trenches, battle debris, evidence of the violence that once consumed this ground. But in 1839, Francis Sorrel wasn't thinking about ghosts. He was thinking about the future. The house took nearly 2 years to complete. It was enormous. 16,000 square feet spread across multiple floors. 52 rooms filled with imported furniture and artwork. The exterior was pure Greek Revival. Limestone walls painted white. Tall columns supporting a covered porch. Symmetrical windows that let light pour into every room. But Kluski added touches that reflected Francis's French background. Mediterranean influences, arched doorways, delicate ironwork. Details that whispered of Saint-Domingue and the world Francis had lost. The main house faced Madison Square, proud and imposing. Behind it sat a separate building, the carriage house. This was where carriages were stored and repaired, but it was also where enslaved people lived and worked. Francis Sorrel, despite escaping slavery's violence in Haiti, owned enslaved individuals himself. Records show he held between 3 and 11 people in bondage throughout his life. He sold some, transported others. This ugly truth sits at the heart of the mansion's story. Beauty built on suffering. Wealth extracted from human lives. Inside the main house, Every detail spoke of luxury. The grand entrance hall featured oak paneling and soaring ceilings. A sweeping staircase curved upward, its banister carved from dark wood. The parlors glowed with chandeliers imported from Europe. The dining room could seat dozens of guests at a single long table. Upstairs, bedrooms stretched down wide hallways. Each had its own fireplace. Each had tall windows that opened to catch the breeze. The house was designed to impress, to announce that Francis Sorrel had arrived, that the boy who'd fled Haiti was now a man who commanded respect. And for nearly 20 years, that's exactly what it did. The Sorrel family filled the house with life. Children ran through its halls. Francis and Matilda hosted dinners and gatherings. They became fixtures of Savannah society. One of their sons, Gilbert Moxley Sorrel, would grow up to become one of the youngest generals in the Confederate Army. At just 26 years old, he commanded troops under General James Longstreet. He fought in some of the Civil War's bloodiest battles. Later, he wrote a memoir called Recollections of a Confederate Staff Officer, which historians still study today. The house on Madison Square was his childhood home, the place where he learned to ride horses in the gardens, the place where he listened to his father's stories about Haiti and revolution. But even as the family thrived, darkness crept into the corners of that grand house. Because beneath the surface, not everything was well. Matilda Sorrel struggled. Life as the wife of one of Savannah's wealthiest men came with pressure, expectations, the constant performance of Southern elegance. She had to manage a household of more than 50 rooms, supervise enslaved workers, host endless social functions, smile, be gracious, never show weakness. And somewhere in those years, something broke inside her. The exact details remain unclear. What historians do know is that at some point in the mid-1800s, Matilda's life came to a tragic end within the walls of that house. She didn't leave behind letters explaining why. No diary entries detailing her pain, just silence. And the house, which had witnessed so much already, now held another kind of darkness, a private grief that the family never spoke about publicly. After Matilda's death, Francis continued living in the house for a short while. But by 1859, he made a decision. He sold the mansion and moved next door to a smaller home at 12 West Harris Street. Perhaps the memories were too heavy. Perhaps he simply wanted a fresh start. The buyer was Henry D. Weed, a wealthy businessman from Connecticut. Weed was a landowner and investor. He saw the mansion not as a family home, but as a symbol of Southern prosperity. He moved in with his family, and the house took on his name. It became the Sorrel-Weed House, the name it still carries today. Under Weed's ownership, the mansion continued to be a centerpiece of Savannah society. But the Civil War was coming, and with it, another wave of violence and loss. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Savannah became a strategic prize. The city's port made it vital for supplying Southern troops. The Union wanted it. The Confederates would fight to keep it. And when General William Tecumseh Sherman began his famous March to the Sea in 1864, Savannah stood in his path. Sherman's troops swept through Georgia, burning plantations and destroying infrastructure. They reached Savannah in December of 1864. But instead of burning the city, Sherman offered it to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. He spared Savannah's historic homes and churches. The Sorrel-Weed House survived. While other Southern mansions fell to fire and cannon, this one remained standing. General Robert E. Lee, a close friend of the Sorrel family, visited the house several times over the years. He walked through its halls, sat in its parlors. The weight of war hung over every conversation. By the time the war ended in 1865, the South was broken. And so was the fortune that had built the mansion. Francis Sorrel died on May 5, 1870. He was 77 years old. He'd lived long enough to see two revolutions, one that destroyed his childhood, another that shattered his adopted country. He was buried in Laurel Grove Cemetery in Savannah. Henry Weed continued living in the mansion until his own death in 1875. The house stayed in the Weed family until 1914. After that, it changed hands several times. For years, it sat vacant. Paint peeled. Gardens grew wild. Rooms that once hosted governors and generals filled with dust and silence. The mansion that had symbolized wealth and power was now a relic, a reminder of a world that no longer existed. In 1940, something remarkable happened. The Society for the Preservation of Savannah Landmarks, later known as the Historic Savannah Foundation, opened the house to the public. It was their very first exhibit. They called it a lone exhibit of furniture and fine arts, 18th and 19th centuries at the Sorrel-Weed House on Madison Square. It ran from January through April of 1940. For the first time, ordinary people could walk through the mansion's halls. They could see the grand staircases and the carved fireplaces. They could imagine what life had been like in the golden age of the Old South. The exhibit was a success. It sparked interest in preserving Savannah's historic architecture. In 1954, the Sorrel-Weed House became one of the first two homes in Georgia to be designated a state landmark. It was official recognition of the house's importance, not just as a beautiful building, but as a piece of American history. Yet for decades after that, the house fell quiet again. It wasn't open to regular tours. It sat like a monument, beautiful but distant, untouchable. And during those quiet years, stories began to spread. Whispers about what had happened within those walls, about the tragedies the house had witnessed, about the feeling that some presences never really leave. By the time the house reopened to the public in 2005, those stories had taken on a life of their own. Today, the Sorrel-Weed House operates as both a museum and a cultural landmark. During the day, visitors can take historical tours that explain the architecture, the craftsmanship, and the lives of the families who lived there. They learn about Charles Kluskey's genius, about Francis Sorrel's journey from Haiti to Savannah, about the Civil War and Reconstruction. The tours are educational, respectful, focused on facts and context. But the house also offers something else: ghost tours. After dark, when shadows stretch long across Madison Square, guides lead groups through the mansion's rooms and down into the carriage house. They tell stories about strange sounds, about cold spots and unexplained sensations, about visitors who claim to feel watched. The house has been featured on television shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, and the Travel Channel's Most Terrifying Places in America. It appeared in the opening scene of the movie Forrest Gump, shot from the rooftop overlooking Madison Square. It's been written about in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and Condé Nast Traveler. The Sorrel-Weed House has become one of the most famous historic homes in America. Not just because of its architecture, but because of the layers of history it represents. Standing in front of the Sorrel-Weed House today, you can feel that weight. The house rises 3 stories above the street, white limestone glowing in the southern sun, columns strong and symmetrical, windows reflecting the oak trees of Madison Square. It looks peaceful, elegant, perfect. But if you know the history, you can't unsee it. You can't forget that this ground once ran red with the blood of soldiers fighting for freedom. That this mansion was built by a man who had escaped one form of violence only to participate in another. That within these walls, lives were lived and lost. That enslaved people worked in the carriage house while their owners dined on imported china. That tragedy touched this family in ways the public would never fully know. The story of the Sorrel-Weed House is the story of America itself. Beautiful and brutal. Elegant and ugly. It's a story about how we build monuments to success while standing on the graves of those who suffered. It's about how history refuses to stay buried. About how the past seeps through floorboards and whispers from corners. About how no amount of Greek revival columns or imported chandeliers can erase what happened before. Francis Sorrel came to America seeking safety. He found it. He built an empire. He raised a family in one of the grandest houses in the South. But he could never escape the ghosts of what he'd seen in Haiti. The revolution that shaped him. The violence that taught him the world could change in an instant. And perhaps that's why he chose to build on a battlefield. Perhaps some part of him understood that you can't outrun history. You can only build on top of it and hope the foundation holds. The architecture of the Sorrel-Weed House tells its own story. Charles Kluski designed it in the Greek Revival style, which was sweeping across America in the 1830s and 40s. Greek Revival represented democracy. It looked back to ancient Athens, to the birthplace of Western civilization. It was a style that said, "We are building something lasting, something important." The tall columns recalled Greek temples. The symmetrical layout reflected order and reason. But Kluski added his own touches. The house isn't purely Greek. It has Regency influences, English elegance, Mediterranean warmth. It's a hybrid. Just like Francis Sorrel himself, a man caught between worlds, between French aristocracy and American capitalism, between the violence of Haiti and the gentility of Savannah. Walk through the house today, and you'll see Kluski's genius everywhere. The proportions are perfect. The light falls just right in every room. The flow from entrance to parlor to dining room feels natural. This wasn't a house designed by committee. This was one man's vision, executed with absolute confidence. Kluski knew exactly what he was doing. He'd studied the masters. He understood balance and symmetry. He knew how to make stone and wood feel alive. The grand staircase in the entrance hall curves upward like a sculpture. The banister is smooth under your hand. The steps are wide and shallow, easy to climb even in the long dresses women wore in that era. Upstairs, the bedrooms are surprisingly intimate. High ceilings, yes, but the proportions make them feel cozy rather than imposing. These were rooms meant to be lived in, not just admired. The carriage house behind the main mansion tells a different story. It's 2 stories tall, brick walls, smaller windows, a place built for work, not elegance. This is where carriages were stored and repaired, where horses were kept, and where enslaved people lived. The contrast between the main house and the carriage house is stark. One built for display, the other built for function. One designed to inspire awe, the other designed to be invisible. That contrast reveals the truth about the Old South. The wealth displayed in the front was made possible by the labor hidden in the back. The beauty of the parlor was paid for by the suffering of people who never got to sit in those velvet chairs. The Sorrel-Weed House doesn't hide that truth. Not anymore. Modern tours acknowledge it. They talk about the enslaved people who worked there. They explain the economics of the plantation system. They help visitors understand that this house, like so many others, was built on a foundation of injustice. Francis Sorrel's life is full of contradictions. He escaped slavery's violence in Haiti. He witnessed the uprising of enslaved people fighting for freedom. He saw what happened when an entire system collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. And then he came to America and participated in the same system. He bought and sold human beings. He profited from their labor. How do we make sense of that? Perhaps we can't. Perhaps that's the point. History isn't simple. People aren't simple. Francis Sorrel was a survivor, a businessman, a father, and a slaveholder. All of those things can be true at once. The house he built stands as a monument to his success, but it also stands as evidence of the system that made that success possible. You can't separate the beauty from the brutality. They're woven together in every brick and beam. Matilda Sorrel's story haunts the house in a different way. We know so little about her. History has erased most of her voice. What we do know is that she was Lucinda's younger sister, that she married Francis 2 years after Lucinda's death, that she bore him children, that she managed a household of more than 50 rooms, that she lived in the shadow of her older sister's memory, and that at some point, the weight of it all became too much. In that era, women had few options. Divorce was scandalous. Running away meant losing your children and your social standing. Mental health was barely understood. If you struggled alone. Matilda's tragedy is one of countless untold stories from that time. Women whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, who suffered in silence because that's what was expected. Her story reminds us that even in the grandest mansions, behind the most elegant facades, real people lived and hurt and sometimes couldn't find a way forward. The house itself seems to hold these stories. People who work there talk about the feeling of the place, how certain rooms feel heavy, how the air changes when you walk into the carriage house, how sometimes, in the quiet moments, you can almost hear something. Footsteps on stairs, doors closing on their own, a sense of presence that can't quite be explained. Are those experiences real? Or are they the product of knowing the history, of walking through rooms where real tragedy occurred? Does it matter? The line between history and haunting is thinner than we like to admit. When you stand in a place where people suffered, where they loved and lost and died, something of them remains. Maybe not in the way ghost stories suggest, but in the way memory works, in the way buildings absorb the energy of the lives lived within them. The Sorrel-Weed House remembers, and it makes sure you remember too. Henry Weed's family owned the house for 55 years, from 1859 to 1914. That's longer than the Sorrels ever lived there. And yet it's the Sorrel name that stuck. Perhaps because Francis was the one who commissioned it, who watched it rise from the battlefield ground, who filled it first with life and hope. Or perhaps because his story is simply more dramatic, more tragic, more American. A refugee who became a tycoon, a survivor who built an empire, a man haunted by revolution who couldn't escape history's long reach. The Weed family's story is quieter. They were Yankees, outsiders. They brought northern money to a southern city. They maintained the house through war and reconstruction. But they never quite belonged the way the Sorrels did. And when the last of them left in 1914, the house began its long decline. The decades between 1914 and 1940 were hard on the mansion. Without a family to care for it, the house deteriorated. Roofs leaked, paint cracked, gardens became jungles, homeless people sometimes sheltered in its empty rooms, vandals broke windows. Time and neglect did what war and revolution couldn't. They nearly destroyed it. But Savannah remembered. The city knew this house mattered. When the Society for the Preservation of Savannah Landmarks formed in 1939, the Sorrel-Weed House was one of their first priorities. They saw what it represented. Not just architectural beauty, but a window into a lost world. They raised money, organized volunteers, started the slow work of preservation. That 1940 exhibit saved the house. It reminded people why these buildings matter, why we should care about preserving the past, even when that past is complicated and painful. Today, the historic Savannah Foundation continues that work. The Sorrel-Weed House is protected, maintained, open to the public. It operates as a museum and educational center. School groups visit to learn about architecture and history. Tourists come from around the world to see one of Georgia's finest Greek Revival homes. And yes, ghost enthusiasts come hoping for something unexplainable. The house accommodates all of them, because all of those stories are part of its identity. The house is a testament to Charles Kluskey's architectural genius. It's a monument to Francis Sorrel's success. It's a reminder of slavery's brutal reality. It's a site of personal tragedy. And it's a place where history feels alive. All of those truths coexist within those 16,000 square feet. The house doesn't choose which story to tell. It tells them all. Madison Square, where the house stands, is beautiful. Oak trees shade the walkways. Benches invite visitors to sit and rest. Monuments mark important moments in Savannah's history. Tourists wander through, cameras in hand. Horse-drawn carriages clip-clop past. The square feels peaceful, timeless. But beneath that peace lies the battlefield. British soldiers dug trenches where those oak trees now grow. Men charged across open ground where tourists now take selfies. Blood soaked into the earth that now grows grass and flowers. The violence of 1779 is invisible now. But it's not gone. It's just buried. Just like so much of history. We pave over battlefields. We build mansions on top of mass graves. We plant gardens where gallows once stood. We do this because we want to move forward, because we want to believe the past is past. But places like the Sorrel-Weed House remind us that the past is never really past. It's always beneath us, always pressing upward, always demanding to be remembered. Francis Sorrel died thinking he'd built something permanent, a legacy, a house that would stand for generations. And he was right. The house still stands, but its meaning has changed. It's no longer just a private residence. It's public history. It belongs to everyone who walks through its doors. The tourists and the students and the ghost hunters and the historians. They all bring their own interpretations, their own questions. And the house accommodates them all, because history is always being reinterpreted, always being understood in new ways. What seemed like unquestionable success in 1840 looks different in 2026. What seemed like Southern elegance now looks like a system built on suffering. That doesn't mean the house isn't beautiful. It is. Stunningly so. But beauty alone isn't enough. We have to ask where that beauty came from. What made it possible? Who paid the price? Walking through the Sorrel-Weed House is an exercise in holding contradictions. You can admire Kluskey's architectural brilliance while acknowledging the system that funded it. You can appreciate the craftsmanship while remembering the enslaved workers. You can feel sadness for Matilda's tragedy while recognizing that she lived in luxury most people never experienced. You can respect Francis Sorrel's survival instinct while condemning his participation in slavery. History is full of contradictions. People are full of contradictions. The house doesn't resolve them. It just holds them all together in one space. And maybe that's the most honest thing a museum can do. Not provide easy answers, but ask hard questions. Not celebrate the past uncritically, but examine it with clear eyes. The Sorrel-Weed House will stand for years to come. Its limestone walls are strong. Its foundation is solid. The historic Savannah Foundation will continue maintaining it. Future generations will walk through its halls. They'll learn about Francis Sorrel and Charles Kluski, about Matilda and Henry Weed, about the siege of Savannah and the Civil War, and they'll add their own interpretations, their own understandings. Because that's how history works. It's not fixed. It's constantly being rewritten as new perspectives emerge. What we see in the house today is different from what people saw in 1940, and what people will see in 2076 will be different again. The facts don't change. Francis Sorrel still commissioned the house in 1839. The siege of Savannah still happened in 1779. Those dates are fixed. But what those facts mean? That changes with every generation. The architectural preservation of the Sorrel-Weed House tells its own remarkable story. When the historic Savannah Foundation took on the project in the late 1930s, they faced enormous challenges. The house had been empty for years. Plaster had crumbled from walls. The roof leaked in dozens of places. Original wallpaper hung in tatters. The grand staircase that Kluski had designed with such care had been altered by the Weed family in the late 19th century. They'd replaced it with a Victorian-style staircase that didn't match the Greek Revival aesthetic. In 1999, preservationists removed that Victorian addition and recreated Kluski's original design based on his plans and similar houses he'd built. It was controversial. Some argued that the Victorian staircase was part of the house's history too, that removing it erased the Weed family's contribution. But others insisted that restoring Kluski's vision was more important, that his architectural integrity mattered more than later alterations. In the end, the restoration proceeded. And today's visitors see a staircase that looks much as it did in 1840. That debate reflects a larger question in historic preservation. What version of a building do you preserve? The original, or the accumulated layers of change over time? Most preservationists now argue for maintaining all periods of a building's history, for showing how it evolved. But in the mid-20th century, the approach was different. Restorers often stripped away later additions to return buildings to their pure original state. The Sorrel-Weed House reflects that older philosophy. What you see today is partly original and partly recreated. The exterior limestone walls are original. The columns are original. The basic structure is Kluski's work. But many interior details have been restored or replaced. The wallpaper is reproduction. The paint colors are best guesses based on historical research. Some of the woodwork is original. Some has been carefully replicated. The house is authentic, but not untouched. It's a carefully maintained version of itself, a performance of history as much as history itself. The carriage house underwent its own restoration. For years it was used for storage, then as a garage. By the 1980s, it was in terrible condition. Archaeologists excavated beneath its floors before restoration work began. They were looking for evidence of the people who'd lived and worked there, the enslaved individuals whose names don't appear in most historical records. What they found was surprising. A depression in the floor that local legend claimed was a burial site turned out to be an old trash pit. It contained animal bones, broken ceramics, metal objects, and personal items. The discovery helped archaeologists understand daily life in the carriage house, what people ate, what tools they used, how they lived when no one was watching. That research continues today. Every excavation reveals new details about the forgotten people who made the grand house possible. The grounds of the Sorrel-Weed House have also been studied extensively. In 2005 and 2008, archaeologists with the Coastal Heritage Society and the Lamar Institute conducted excavations around Madison Square. They were looking for remnants of the British fortifications from the Siege of Savannah. What they found exceeded expectations. At Spring Hill, the site of the bloodiest fighting, they discovered portions of the British redoubt exactly where historical accounts said it should be. The fortifications were remarkably well preserved. You could see where soldiers had stood, where cannons had been positioned, where the earth had been thrown up to create defensive walls. In Madison Square itself, they found another section of fortifications. And west of the square, at the old Jewish burying ground, they located the position where troops from Saint-Domingue had served as reserves during the battle. Those archaeological discoveries transformed understanding of the siege. For decades, historians had debated exactly where different units had been positioned. Now they had physical evidence. The battlefield wasn't just an abstraction. It was real, tangible, buried just beneath modern Savannah's surface, and the Sorrel-Weed House sat right in the middle of it all. The house's grounds were part of the battlefield. The gardens where Francis Sorrel's children once played were built on ground where men had died. That knowledge changed how people saw the mansion. It wasn't just a beautiful historic home. It was a memorial, a marker on a battlefield that most people had forgotten. The preservation of Savannah's Revolutionary War battlefield resources became a major project. Public meetings were held to discuss how to manage and interpret these sites. Should they mark where fortifications had been? Should they create monuments? Should they build a museum? The debates continue, but the Sorrel-Weed House has become a central part of that conversation, because it literally sits on history. You can't separate the house from the battlefield. You can't tell one story without the other. Every tour of the mansion now includes information about the siege. Visitors learn about Count Pulaski's death, about the troops from Haiti who fought for American independence decades before their own island won freedom, about the brutal reality of 18th century warfare. The house has become a doorway into multiple layers of history: colonial, revolutionary, antebellum, Civil War, Reconstruction. All of it visible in one building. Charles Kluski's legacy extends far beyond the Sorrel-Weed House. He designed dozens of buildings across Georgia before his death in 1871. Many still stand. In Savannah alone, he created the Champion McAlpin Fowlkes House, another stunning Greek Revival mansion. He designed the Kluski Embankment Stores, a series of brick vaults built into the riverfront that still exist today. In Augusta, his medical college building remains in use, now part of Augusta University. The governor's mansion in Milledgeville, perhaps his most famous work besides the Sorrel-Weed House, underwent complete restoration in the 1960s and again in the early 2000s. It's now a museum and National Historic Landmark. Kluski also worked on projects in Washington, D.C., including proposals for renovating the Capitol building. Most of his suggestions weren't implemented, but they showed his ambition, his belief that he belonged among America's greatest architects. Kluski's life ended sadly. In 1869, he returned to Georgia to rebuild the St. Simon's Island Lighthouse, which had been damaged during the Civil War. While working on the project, he contracted malaria. He died in January of 1871 before the lighthouse was completed. He was buried in Savannah. His grave is simple: unmarked for years until historians located it and placed a proper memorial. For decades, Kluski was nearly forgotten. Architectural historians knew his name, but the general public didn't. That began to change in the late 20th century as interest in historic preservation grew. Now he's recognized as one of the most important architects of the antebellum South. His buildings are studied, documented, protected. The Sorrel-Weed House stands as his masterpiece, the purest expression of his vision. Francis Sorrel's business ventures extended far beyond his mansion. As a commission merchant, he controlled significant trade with the Caribbean. His ships carried cotton, rice, and timber south. They returned with sugar, coffee, and manufactured goods. He built warehouses along Savannah's riverfront, invested in local banks, served on civic committees. He was a pillar of the community. Yet that respectability was built on a foundation most modern Americans find unconscionable. His wealth came from a system of forced labor. His beautiful home was maintained by people who had no freedom, no choice, no voice. That contradiction sits at the center of his legacy. He was simultaneously a successful immigrant who built an empire from nothing and a participant in one of history's greatest moral crimes. Both things are true. Neither cancels out the other. The story of the Sorrel-Weed House intersects with larger narratives about preservation and memory in the American South. After the Civil War, the South struggled with its identity. The old plantation system was gone. The Confederate cause was lost. But many white Southerners wanted to preserve their vision of antebellum society. They created the lost cause mythology, the idea that the South had fought for states' rights rather than slavery, that plantation life had been genteel and noble, that enslaved people had been content. Historic homes like the Sorrel-Weed House became props in that mythology. They were presented as evidence of Southern civilization, Southern refinement. The darker truths about how that civilization was built were minimized or ignored entirely. The 1940 exhibit that reopened the house reflected that problematic approach. The focus was entirely on architecture and furnishings, on the Sorrel family's social standing, on the elegance of the lifestyle. Slavery was barely mentioned. The enslaved people who worked in the house were invisible. That was standard practice at the time. Most historic house museums in the South presented a sanitized version of the past. They showed visitors the parlors and dining rooms. They talked about the china and the silver. They didn't talk about the people who cooked the food or served the meals. They certainly didn't talk about the violence and degradation that made the whole system possible. That began to change in the late 20th century. The civil rights movement forced America to reckon with its racial history. Historians started asking different questions about slavery and the plantation system. Museums began acknowledging uncomfortable truths. The process was slow, contentious. Many people resisted. They wanted to preserve their idealized vision of Southern history. But gradually, more honest narratives emerged. Today, the Sorrel-Weed House doesn't hide from its history. Tours acknowledge the enslaved people who worked there. They discuss the economics of slavery. They explain how wealth like Francis Sorrel's was created and maintained. The house has become a teaching tool, not just about architecture, but about the full complexity of American history. The rise of dark tourism has added another dimension to the house's story. Dark tourism refers to travel to sites associated with death and tragedy. Battlefields, prisons, sites of atrocities. The Sorrel-Weed House fits that category. Its association with tragedy, combined with its reputation for paranormal activity, draws visitors who might never come for a purely architectural tour. Some preservationists worry about this. They fear the ghost tours trivialize the real history, that they turn tragedy into entertainment. Others argue that ghost tours bring people in who then learn the actual history, that they're a gateway to education. The debate continues, but the reality is that the ghost tours help fund the house's maintenance. The ticket revenue supports preservation work. So the house accommodates both audiences, the history buffs and the thrill seekers, the architecture students and the paranormal investigators. The house's appearance in popular culture has also raised its profile. The opening shot of Forrest Gump, filmed from the Sorrel-Weed House's rooftop in 1993, introduced the mansion to millions of viewers worldwide. Television shows have featured it repeatedly. Magazine articles describe it as one of America's most haunted houses. That fame brings visitors, and visitors bring money. Money that keeps the house standing. It's a pragmatic calculation. Use the house's dark reputation to fund its preservation. Some purists object, but others point out that historic preservation is expensive, that without income, many important buildings would crumble. The Sorrel-Weed House has found a way to survive in the 21st century, by being many things to many people. Museum, tourist attraction, event venue, educational center. All of it together keeps the doors open and the roof repaired. Gilbert Moxley. Sorrel's story deserves deeper exploration. Born in the Sorrel-Weed House in 1838, he grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege. His childhood was spent in that grand mansion on Madison Square. He attended the best schools, learned to ride horses in the gardens, listened to his father's stories about Haiti. When the Civil War erupted, Moxley was just 23 years old. He was working as a bank clerk in Savannah, a comfortable position for a young man from a prominent family. But when Georgia seceded, he felt duty-bound to fight. He traveled to Virginia and joined the Confederate Army. He served on General James Longstreet's staff, proved himself capable, rose through the ranks with remarkable speed. By 1864, at just 26 years old, he was promoted to brigadier general. He was wounded 3 times during the war, fought in major battles from First Manassas to Petersburg. When the war ended, he returned to Savannah, worked in the shipping business, and eventually wrote his memoir. Recollections of a Confederate staff officer, published in 1805, is considered one of the best first-hand accounts of the Confederate war effort. Sorrel wrote with clarity and honesty. He didn't romanticize the war, didn't claim it was glorious. He described the chaos, the suffering, the mistakes. But he also remained loyal to the Confederate cause until his death in 1901. He never renounced his service, never expressed regret about fighting for a nation whose purpose was preserving slavery. That complexity makes him a difficult historical figure. He was intelligent, capable, a skilled military officer. But he fought for something indefensible. His childhood home, the Sorrel-Weed House, now interprets his story within that fuller context. Acknowledging his military accomplishments while not shying away from what he was fighting for. The relationship between historic homes and honest history